The afternoon sun hung low over Riverside Park on May 14, 2004, casting long shadows through the oak trees that lined the walking path. Sarah Mitchell had stopped to retie her son's sneakers, bright red high tops with Velcro straps he'd insisted on wearing that morning, despite the scuff marks along the sides. The 9-year-old had been counting acorns in his pocket, already up to 17, when she straightened and reached for his hand. But the space beside her was empty. The red sneakers were gone. Only the distant laughter of children on the playground and the rustle of new leaves filled the air where her son had stood 3 seconds before. She called his name once, then twice, her voice steady at first. Parents lose sight of their children in parks all the time. They wander behind trees, chase squirrels, duck into restrooms. But Marcus Mitchell wasn't a wanderer. He was methodical, cautious, the kind of child who asked permission before taking a second cookie. Sarah's third call came louder, drawing the attention of a woman pushing a stroller near the water fountain. Within minutes, a dozen park-goers were fanning out across the 15-acre green space, calling for a boy in a blue striped shirt and those unmistakable red shoes. The police arrived at 4:47 p.m. Officer Dennis Carver took the report, while his partner walked the perimeter with a photo Sarah kept in her wallet, Marcus's school picture from 3 months earlier, his gap-toothed smile captured against a mottled blue background. They found nothing in the first sweep. No torn clothing, no disturbance in the mulch near the playground, no witnesses who remembered seeing a boy matching his description after 3:30. The park's single security camera, mounted near the parking lot entrance, had malfunctioned 2 days prior. The timing felt cruel in its precision. If you're watching from another part of the world, drop a comment and let us know where you are. This story crosses borders in ways no one expected, and if cases like this matter to you, subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. By nightfall, the search had grown. Volunteers arrived with flashlights and thermoses of coffee, dividing into grids that extended beyond the park into adjacent neighborhoods. Dogs from the County K9 unit picked up Marcus's scent near the eastern entrance, but lost it at the sidewalk, suggesting he'd gotten into a vehicle. The news vans arrived around 10, their bright lights turning the park into a stage. Sarah stood before the cameras and spoke in sentences that felt rehearsed by repetition alone. 9 years old, brown hair, brown eyes, last seen wearing red high-top sneakers. She held up the shoes' twin pair, still sitting by the front door at home, where he'd left them the day before. The first 48 hours moved with desperate momentum. Police checked registered offenders within a 50-mile radius. They interviewed park regulars, reviewed receipts from the ice cream vendor who worked weekends, and requested surveillance footage from businesses along the routes leading away from Riverside. A clerk at a gas station 2 miles north remembered a boy matching Marcus's description getting into a silver sedan around 4 o'clock, but the detail remained unverified. The station's cameras recorded over themselves every 72 hours, and by the time investigators arrived, the footage was gone. The lead became one more entry in a growing file of maybes and almosts. Sarah's husband, Robert, took leave from his job at the printing plant. Their home transformed into a command center plastered with maps, timeline charts and printouts of every registered vehicle matching the gas station clerk's vague description. Friends organized search parties that swept through nearby towns, posting flyers on telephone poles and grocery store bulletin boards. Marcus's face appeared on the evening news across 3 states. Tips poured in, dozens daily at first, but each one dissolved under scrutiny. A boy spotted at a rest stop in Pennsylvania turned out to be a cousin visiting relatives. A sighting at a mall in Ohio was a child 3 years younger. Hope became a thing measured in phone calls that led nowhere. The emotional architecture of the Mitchell household began to crack in small, specific ways. Robert marked days on a kitchen calendar with red X's, each one a testimony to absence. Sarah couldn't bring herself to wash Marcus's bedsheets, convinced his scent would disappear with the detergent. His teacher sent homework assignments for the first month, a gesture that felt both thoughtful and unbearably optimistic. By autumn, the assignments stopped coming. The red high tops remained by the door, gathering dust in a house where time had fractured into before and after. Detective Maria Gonzalez inherited the case in its third month when it transitioned from active investigation to long-term missing persons. She was 42, a veteran of the Crimes Against Children unit, with a reputation for meticulous record-keeping and an uncanny ability to notice patterns in seemingly random data. She'd worked cases that stretched across years, and she understood something most people didn't. Disappearances rarely resolved themselves through dramatic breakthroughs. They unraveled slowly through cross-referenced databases, updated forensic techniques, and the unglamorous work of checking and rechecking details that had been overlooked the first time. Maria requested Marcus's DNA profile be entered into CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system, which maintains genetic records for missing persons and unidentified remains. She coordinated with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children to create age progression images, computer-generated renderings of what Marcus might look like at 10, then 11, then 12. Each year, new posters went out. Each year, the hope that someone, somewhere, might recognize the boy in the updated image. The financial toll mounted in ways the Mitchells hadn't anticipated. Private investigators charged by the hour. Travel expenses accumulated from following leads that required in-person verification. Robert's employer eventually needed him back full-time, and the reduced household income forced difficult decisions. They took out a second mortgage to fund a billboard campaign along I-40, Marcus's face 40 feet high, asking drivers if they'd seen him. The billboard stayed up for 8 months before the contract expired and the funds ran dry. Sarah began attending a support group for parents of missing children, meeting Thursday evenings in a church basement that smelled of old coffee and photocopier toner. The stories there varied in detail, but shared a common thread of suspended grief, unable to mourn, unable to move forward. A mother whose daughter vanished in 1998 spoke about ambiguous loss, the psychological term for loving someone whose status remains unresolved. It was, she said, like holding your breath underwater without knowing if you'd ever surface. Sarah understood completely. Years passed with the peculiar weight of unanswered questions. Marcus would have turned 13, then 15, then 17. The Mitchells celebrated his birthday each May 8th with a cake they didn't eat, candles they lit in empty rooms. Robert developed a habit of driving past parks on weekend afternoons, scanning playgrounds for a face that would be older now, changed in ways he couldn't predict. Sarah kept Marcus's room exactly as he'd left it, the astronomy posters on the walls, the unfinished Lego project on his desk, the red sneakers by the door downstairs, serving as a shrine to a normal Friday afternoon that never came home. Detective Gonzalez never closed the file. She checked it quarterly, running Marcus's information through updated databases, comparing against unidentified children who'd entered foster systems or medical facilities without proper documentation. She investigated a lead in 2011 involving a teenager in Montana who'd been found wandering with no memory of his identity, but dental records ruled out a match. She followed up on a tip in 2014 about a young man working at an auto shop in Tennessee who bore a resemblance to the age progression images, but that too led nowhere. Each dead end was documented, filed, and added to the growing record of a boy who'd simply vanished. The break came not from police work, but from bureaucratic coincidence in the spring of 2022. A social worker named Jennifer Chu was processing intake paperwork for a substance abuse treatment facility in Asheville, North Carolina, when she noticed an irregularity in a patient's identification documents. The man, who'd checked himself in voluntarily, carried a driver's license issued in 2019 under the name David Brennan. But his social security number, when run through the system for insurance verification, flagged an inconsistency. The number had been reported as fraudulent in 2006 and belonged to a deceased individual. Standard protocol required Jennifer to file a report with the state's Identity Fraud Division. The agent assigned to investigate, Thomas Ray, began tracing the paper trail backward. David Brennan had obtained his license using a birth certificate from Indiana, but when officials contacted the county clerk's office, they found no record of anyone by that name born on the date listed. The birth certificate was a forgery, competent enough to pass initial scrutiny, but lacking the security features implemented after 2008. Thomas expanded his search, looking for any official documentation tied to the name. He found a high school diploma from a private institution that had closed in 2015, making verification impossible, and a rental history showing David had lived at 3 different addresses in North Carolina over the past decade. What Thomas didn't find was any record of David Brennan existing before 2016. No elementary school transcripts, no medical records, no juvenile documentation of any kind. It was as if the person had materialized fully formed at age 21 with a fraudulent identity and a history that couldn't withstand scrutiny. Thomas flagged the case for potential trafficking or exploitation and requested a forensic interview. The interview took place on a Tuesday morning in a conference room with pale green walls and industrial carpeting. David Brennan sat across from Thomas and a victim specialist named Patricia Moore, his hands folded on the table. He was 27, according to the paperwork, lean and soft-spoken, with brown hair that fell across his forehead and a hesitation in his speech that suggested he was choosing each word carefully. When Thomas explained that his identity couldn't be verified and asked where he was actually from, David went quiet for nearly a minute. Then he said something that would set an investigation in motion across 18 years of silence. "I think I'm from somewhere in Virginia. There was a park with oak trees, and I had red shoes." Patricia asked him to elaborate. David described fragments: a woman who might have been his mother, a house with blue shutters, a school where he'd been in 4th grade. But the memories were distant, viewed through frosted glass, and he couldn't produce names or addresses. He'd been with a man he called Ray, he said, for as long as he could remember having solid memories. Ray had told him his parents died in a car accident when he was young, that Ray was his uncle, that they needed to move around frequently for Ray's work. They'd lived in Tennessee, then Georgia, then North Carolina. Ray homeschooled him using books from thrift stores and taught him to avoid asking questions about the past. When Ray died of a heart attack in 2016, David had been 21 and alone, with no idea how to verify who he actually was. Thomas contacted the FBI's Violent Crimes Against Children unit. Within 48 hours, a specialist named Agent Lisa Trent arrived to coordinate with local authorities. She requested a DNA sample from David and submitted it to CODIS with priority processing. The system compared his genetic profile against the database of missing persons, searching for familial matches that might identify him even if his direct profile wasn't on file. The results came back in 11 days. David Brennan was Marcus Mitchell, last seen in Riverside Park 18 years earlier, wearing red high-top sneakers. Agent Trent made the call to Detective Gonzalez, who was now 59 and 3 months from retirement. Maria had kept the file active all this time, updating it with annual reviews, even when there was nothing new to report. When she heard the news, she sat at her desk for several minutes without speaking. the phone still pressed to her ear. Then she asked Agent Trent to repeat everything, taking notes in the same careful handwriting she'd used to document the case since 2004. The notification to Sarah and Robert Mitchell followed protocol designed to minimize shock and ensure support was in place. Maria drove to their home herself, arriving on a Thursday afternoon when spring rain was just beginning to tap against the windows. She sat in their living room, the same room where she'd taken their statement 18 years earlier, and told them their son was alive. Sarah made a sound that wasn't quite a word, something between a gasp and a sob. Robert stood and walked to the window, his back to the room, shoulders shaking silently. The red sneakers were no longer by the door. They'd been moved to Marcus's room years ago, but the space where they'd sat remained somehow visible, a ghost outline in the household's memory. The reunion was arranged with the care of a surgical procedure. Trauma specialists briefed both parties separately. Marcus, he'd asked to be called that now, though the name felt strange in his mouth, was warned about the dissonance between the mother he barely remembered and the woman who'd aged 18 years in his absence. Sarah and Robert were counseled about the young man their 9-year-old had become, about the gaps in his memory and the complicated grief of time that couldn't be recovered. Everyone signed consent forms. Everyone agreed to have therapists present. They met in a neutral space, a family counseling center with comfortable furniture and windows that overlooked a garden. Sarah brought a photo album and the red sneakers, now faded and creased with age, but preserved carefully in a clear plastic box. When Marcus walked into the room, she stood but didn't approach immediately, giving him the agency to close the distance or maintain it. He looked at her face, then at his father's, searching for recognition in features that memory couldn't quite confirm. Then he saw the shoes in their plastic case, and something shifted behind his eyes. "I remember those," he said quietly. "I was counting acorns." Sarah nodded, tears streaming freely now. "You had 17. Oh, the conversation that followed was halting, punctuated by long silences and questions that had no good answers. Marcus remembered fragments of the park, the feeling of his hand being taken, getting into a car with someone who said his mother had sent him. He remembered years of moving, of Ray's insistence that they couldn't contact authorities because there were legal problems Marcus wouldn't understand. He remembered believing it, the way children believe adults who speak with certainty. He remembered the isolation of being homeschooled in temporary apartments, the absence of friends or stable routines, the slow normalization of a life that had begun with a theft he couldn't name. Ray Brennan, it turned out, had been Raymond Kohler, a registered sex offender who'd moved from state to state, violating parole conditions and evading warrants. He'd taken Marcus opportunistically, seeing a child momentarily unsupervised, and had spent 18 years convincing the boy that his identity as David Brennan was the only truth that mattered. When Raymond died in 2016, he'd left behind no records, no legal documents, nothing that could help Marcus reconstruct who he'd been before. The young man had simply continued living as David, using the fraudulent identity because it was the only one he had, until a social worker's diligence caught the inconsistency that unraveled everything. The legal aftermath moved through predictable channels. Raymond Kohler was dead, sparing everyone a trial, but denying any real answers about his motivations or methods. The FBI investigated potential accomplices and found none. It appeared Raymond had acted alone, moving frequently enough to avoid detection. Charges couldn't be filed against a corpse, but the case was closed officially, the kidnapping solved even if justice remained elusive. Marcus was issued corrected identification documents, his legal name restored, his social security number recovered from bureaucratic limbo. Reintegration proved far more complex than paperwork. Marcus moved into a small apartment, rather than returning to his childhood home, needing space to process who he'd been, who he'd become, and how to reconcile the two. He attended therapy 3 times a week, working through the trauma of abduction and the stranger grief of reconnecting with parents who were essentially new people to him. Sarah and Robert navigated their own therapy, learning to parent an adult son who carried memories of being their child, but couldn't access the emotional continuity that should have connected those points in time. The relationship rebuilt slowly, through weekly dinners and careful conversations that avoided pressure or expectation. Marcus learned about the searches, the billboards, the years his mother had kept his room untouched. Sarah and Robert learned about the books Marcus loved, the way he'd taught himself guitar using online videos, the ordinary interests of a young man who'd lived an extraordinary interruption. Trust accumulated in small deposits, a shared meal, a phone call initiated by Marcus rather than his parents the first time he called Sarah Mom without the word catching in his throat. The red sneakers found their final resting place in Marcus's apartment, displayed on a shelf where he could see them daily. They weren't a relic of tragedy anymore, but a tether point, proof that the 9-year-old counting acorns had been real, that the life interrupted could be acknowledged even if it couldn't be resumed. Sarah had wanted him to keep them. They were, she said, the only physical thing that had traveled the full distance from the moment he was taken to the moment he came back. Marcus enrolled in community college courses, working toward a degree in social work. The career choice wasn't symbolic or reactive. He was simply drawn to helping people navigate systems that often felt designed to obscure rather than clarify. He volunteered with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, speaking occasionally about the strange territory of being recovered rather than rescued, of waking up one day to discover your entire history had been rewritten without your consent. His talks focused on the practical realities, the difficulty of rebuilding credit with an identity that had been dormant for 2 decades, the challenge of explaining employment gaps, the ongoing therapy required to process abduction trauma that often went unrecognized because it lacked the dramatic violence people associated with kidnapping cases. Detective Gonzalez attended Marcus's first public speaking event 6 months after his recovery. She sat in the back row of a community center auditorium and listened to him describe the moment he realized he was a missing person rather than an orphan with a dead uncle. Afterward, she introduced herself, and Marcus thanked her for never closing his file, for checking quarterly when no one would have faulted her for moving on. Maria told him what she told few people. She had a son close to Marcus's age, and every case file she maintained was approached as if it were him out there somewhere, waiting to be found. They stayed in touch afterward, occasional emails that carried no particular agenda beyond mutual respect. The Mitchells established a foundation in 2023 focused on improving cross-jurisdictional communication for missing children cases. They funded training for social workers on recognizing identity fraud indicators, sponsored DNA banking initiatives for families with missing members, and advocated for better integration between state databases and federal systems. The work gave purpose to years of helpless waiting, transformed passive grief into active contribution. Sarah spoke at conferences about ambiguous loss and the particular agony of cases that remain unresolved for decades. Robert managed the Foundation's logistics with the same meticulous attention he'd once applied to marking calendars with red X's. Each day now counted as progress rather than absence. Marcus's relationship with his parents continued to evolve in unexpected directions. He couldn't recover the childhood they'd lost, but he could build an adult relationship grounded in honesty about the strangeness of their situation. They celebrated his birthday twice each year now, once on the actual date, May 8th, and once on the anniversary of his recovery, the day Sarah called his second birthday, when he'd been returned to a family he barely remembered, but was learning to belong to again. The dual celebrations felt appropriate somehow, an acknowledgement that Marcus contained multitudes, the 9-year-old frozen in memory, the young man shaped by years with Raymond Kohler, and the person he was still becoming as he integrated those fractured identities into something whole. The question of what Marcus remembered versus what he'd been told remained blurry territory. Memory, the therapists explained, is reconstructive rather than photographic. It fills gaps with plausible narratives, incorporates suggestions from others, and sometimes invents wholesale to create coherence where chaos actually existed. Marcus might never know if his memories of the park were genuine retrieval or constructed from photographs and stories people shared after his recovery. But authenticity mattered less than continuity. The red sneakers were real. The acorns he'd counted were real. The family working to know each other again was real, even if the path that connected them ran through 18 years of darkness. The case prompted policy changes in several states. North Carolina implemented stricter verification protocols for identification documents, requiring multiple forms of corroboration before issuing licenses. The FBI expanded funding for forensic genealogy training, recognizing how genetic databases could solve cold cases when traditional investigative methods stalled. Advocacy groups pushed for mandatory DNA collection from unidentified minors entering foster or medical systems, creating safety nets to catch children who'd been trafficked or abducted and given false identities. Marcus's recovery, while deeply personal, became a data point demonstrating how institutional failures could be corrected when agencies prioritized coordination over territorial silos. Sarah returned to Riverside Park for the first time in 19 years, on a quiet Tuesday morning in autumn. The oak trees had grown taller, their canopy thicker than she remembered. The playground equipment had been updated, the old metal structures replaced with modern plastic and rubber surfacing. But the walking path remained the same, winding through grass that turned golden in October light. She walked the route she'd walked that day, stopped at the spot where she'd bent to tie Marcus's shoes, and allowed herself to remember without the crushing weight of not knowing. He was alive. He was safe. The ending hadn't been the one she'd imagined during those first desperate weeks, but it was an ending, and it was real. For families still waiting, still searching, still posting updated age progression images each year, the Mitchell story offers something precious, proof that cases can break open decades later through unglamorous coincidences and diligent bureaucrats. It offers a reminder that missing doesn't always mean gone, that the systems designed to protect and identify can work when properly funded and coordinated. And it offers the uncomfortable truth that recovery is its own form of grief, that getting someone back after 18 years isn't the restoration of what was lost, but the beginning of learning who they've become in absence's long shadow. Marcus Mitchell keeps the red sneakers visible as a daily reminder that the boy who counted acorns didn't disappear entirely. He just took an unplanned detour through someone else's life before finding his way back to his own. The shoes are worn and faded, the Velcro barely functional, but they remain the most honest object in his apartment. Evidence that he existed before the theft. Proof that some threads, however frayed, can be traced back to where they began. On difficult days, when the weight of reintegration feels impossible, he looks at them and remembers what his mother told him the first time they met after his recovery. You counted 17 acorns, and I never forgot. We never stopped looking. Ndish, if you or someone you know is navigating the aftermath of a missing person case, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children provides resources and support at 1-800-THE-LOST. For families dealing with ambiguous loss, organizations like the Polly Klaas Foundation offer counseling referrals and community support designed specifically for the unique challenges of unresolved disappearances. The work of searching doesn't end with recovery. It transforms into the different work of rebuilding, and no one should have to navigate that process alone.